All right, everyone. Hello, welcome to this little webinar about Camunda best practices. My name is Jakob Freund, and with me is Bernd Rücker. Bernd is not just my co-founder, but he's also kind of in charge of these best practices. So this is why he will give this presentation. The only thing that I would like to add is that should you have any questions, there's a possibility to ask questions. So there's kind of a chat window on the right-hand side. Where you can just type in your questions in case you have any, and we will then answer them at the end. This is an exclusive webinar, so it's really for our customers and our official partners only, so it's a pretty small group attending now. And so hopefully we should be able to answer all the questions if they come up. One thing I would like to do before I actually hand over to Bernd is just a little really tiny survey about these best practices, because they have been made available a few weeks ago already. So what I would love to know is if anyone has already checked them out. So I will quickly start this poll. So give me a second. And there we go. So now I should see a multiple choice kind of question. So please just quickly let us know if you have already, been using best practices or not at all, or kind of sell them from time to time. So Dan can then relate to that. And if most of you turn out to haven't checked them out at all, then you can actually adjust to that. So answers are trickling in. Looks like it's pretty even between those who have had a look at them at least already. Yeah, well, 43% saying they haven't checked them out at all so far, about 40%. Okay, and I believe that it makes sense to just really also give the general introductions so that people know what the best practices are about and where they can find them and how they can use them. But you know that certainly better than I do. So what I will do now is I will close this little survey. All right. And Bernd, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jakob. So welcome, everybody. I want to give a short introduction in the Camunda best practices today, as Jakob already announced. I don't want to give a lot of words about me at that moment, so you might already know me. I'm the other founder of Camunda, besides Jakob, and I'm basically have a very technical background in Java Enterprise and doing workflow projects for more than 10 years now. So in that time, I gained quite some experience about BPM and workflow. If you have any questions, even after the best practice session, you see my email here, so don't hesitate to send any emails with questions about the best practices to me afterwards. So what are the best practices? So we started that initiative basically 1 year ago when we were in a phase in Camunda where we started to grow really on a big pace. So we started to get more colleagues, so more employees, more consultants, more customers, a much bigger community, more projects. And so we basically scaled up the company a lot, and we saw really a huge amount of projects using Camunda BPM over time. And we wanted basically to collect the knowledge and the experience we gained in the projects somewhere and somehow, and that's how we started the best practices. And the goals we had in mind were basically to provide these very valuable informations to you as a customer and as a partner, basically to make it easier for you to make or to do successful projects. So that's, I think, something that differentiate us from at least some other vendors, that we really care that you're doing successful projects and that you can apply Camunda BPM in your real life scenarios very well. And in order to help you with that, we want to provide you as much experience as we can, and that's one of the main goals of the best practices here. A second thing which I want to show with a couple of examples later on is that we already have a lot of resources online available, like the user guide, especially the user guide and the guides in the documentations. But they basically concentrate on features like you can see how, for example, how a Java delegate is working, how authorizations are working and these kind of things. But we wanted to have a more problem-oriented access to the information. So whenever you ask yourself a question, I want to call, for example, an SAP or a Siebel system or a SOAP web service, how can I do that? So that's the problem you have. And then to find the right information much easier than you can do now. Another goal was actually to remember tricks or hints we found at various customers, even ourselves sometimes. So to save time, to re-evaluate possible solutions over and over again, and just to write them down to remember them. And that also allows for a consistent consulting approach. So the more colleagues we get, the more consultants we have, the more partners we have, the more interesting it is to sync between them, to discuss the best practices in order to make it possible that everybody has the same view on it. And if we have different views, at least we have a possibility to know and to discuss them basically. And that's also a very important aspect. So as soon as we write something down, it's a good basis to discuss it. So whatever you see today or you read in the best practices, it's a snapshot of the of our current experience written down, but that makes it possible to discuss it. So if you don't agree, that's perfectly fine. I mean, maybe you missed something or we missed something, so you can always start a discussion with us, and that always helps to improve the best practices, to either to change them or maybe to explain it better or whatever it is. So in order to do that, we wanted to write them down. So these were basically the goals we had in mind when we started it. And one important aspect is that the best practices shall not replace the user guide in any way. So the user guide still explains the feature. So how do you exactly do it? But the best practices normally guide you the way to the right features. So why should you use the feature? Which of the alternatives you should use, and what are the drawbacks and these kind of things. And then normally we link to the user guide. So I'll show you an example in a minute. It allows us actually also to describe things we will never have in the user guide because it's out of the scope of the core product. So for example, calling SAP or Siebel system is not part of the core product because we don't have a SAP connector, for example. So it will never be in the user guide. However, it's a problem a lot of customers face in the projects. So that's something we want to tackle, where we want to give some guidance how other customers, for example, solve this issue. So this is possible in the best practices. That comes with a price, which is actually very important. That's why I wanted to highlight it at the very beginning, where everybody is still listening, I hope. So the best practices are not part of the Camunda BPM product. They don't have the same guarantees as the product has, so they are not supported in that same sense. So, for example, we might have code examples in the best practices. So maybe you want to copy them and use them in your own project, and if that breaks, you cannot open up a support case with a 24/7 severity and force us to help you, because it's not included in the support. Nobody stops you from opening a support case, and as I said earlier, we are happy to take any feedback, and we are trying to keep everything up to date and everything running. So it doesn't mean that best practice should be bad quality, but we don't give that guarantee. So that's very important to know, and that's, for us, that's also a big gain, because then we can widen the scope. Okay. But that's important. If we use internal API, we do that not very often, but sometimes for tiny things, it's unavoidable to say, okay, you can do that in such a way, but you have to use internal API. Then we make that very clear, and that's always a big warning. Okay, because using internal API is not supported. We might change that with every version. So for maintenance, it's not a good idea to do. So should not be there very often, actually. Okay, so let's start with an example. So a typical problem might be you want to call a SOAP web service. So when you look in the user guide, you get help in a way that you can find the service task, the BPMN service task, because that's what you should use for that. That's the first thing you have to know, that you have to use the BPMN service task. And with the BPMN service task, you can have a couple of alternatives used. So, for example, a connector, Java delegate, expression. So you also have to decide for the right alternative. And if that's a SOAP web service, you also have to think maybe of using Java client code generation. That's what we normally recommend. Use a Java delegate, use Java client code generation for the SOAP web service, because that's normal Java. That's so if you Google for that, you will find the first 10 links will be good tutorials explaining exactly how to do that. So that's something you can easily do, and which we normally recommend to do. But it's not in the user guide because it's not scope of the Camunda product. So if you use, for example, JAX WS client generation, it's not part of Camunda, it's part of the Java Cosmos. And that's why it's not in the user guide. But what I said earlier, the best practices should guide you through that decision, basically. So if we stick to that example, let's jump in the best practices, and there I will show you how to basically how to find these information. So first things first, the best practices are available online, so you can go to that a bit bigger to camunda.com/best practices. You will have access to that. It's password protected, but you can use your enterprise subscription credentials. So all our partners, our enterprise customers have these credentials. So your company has these credentials. We sometimes hear that, for example, developers have no access to these login, username and password. Try to be persistent. It's no problem to share that in the whole company. So sometimes we hear arguments like, I cannot share that with my developers because the more people have that, the more people access the Camunda stuff, the more expensive it gets or whatever. It's just not true. So that's a company-wide login. It's used to download stuff, to go to the maven repository, and also to access the best practices. So just try to get the access, try to be persistent. You should get the login somewhere. And then you can just access the best practices. You can do that right now if you like. And you should see exactly the same that I see at the moment because I'm using the same version. And then, for example, you can access it by keyword. So if I stick to the SOAP web service, I could, for example, search for the SOAP keyword, and then I see, I can invoke services from the process. That's a best practice, okay? And then the best practice are typically, I make it a bit smaller, are always in the same structure. So we give a short introduction. And then in this case, we're basically explain some basics. And then in this case, because we have a lot of alternatives, we have something we have very often in the best practices. We have kind of a decision table where we say, okay, there are alternatives you can use in order to do that. And there are forces or consequences or basically that. Which might help you to decide the right alternative. So in this case, you could use either Java delegate as a named bean if you're using CDI or Spring, or as a plain Java class. You can use an expression, you can use a connector, or you could use an external task. We're currently, by the way, we're having a backlog, so we're adding a lot of things to the backlog on the way, or if you get feedback, or if we use that in consulting assignments. And currently, we also have in the backlog, for example, to add script tasks here. So we're getting more and more polyglot customers using other languages than Java, so the script task gets more and more important here. So that's something in this case we will add later on, for example. Okay. So and that's thing. So that Java delegate might be a good way to go. I don't want to go to the details of the table. So, for example, advantages are you can use code completion, you can use the refactoring, the IDE, compiler checks, maybe dependency injection, but only if you use it as an NP, so not as a Java class, for example. It might have forces on testing and so on and so on. So I don't want to go into details. I just want to make the idea clear. Very often, if possible, we give a recommendation. It's not always possible because sometimes it really depends on what you want to do. But we try, and in all the discussions, so we're discussing all the best practices internally in the whole consulting team before releasing them. And we always try to force us to think in a way, can we give one recommendation without losing too much? And if that's somehow possible, we want to do that because what we try to achieve is to minimize the decisions you have to make. So if you basically don't care, there should be always one way to go. And in this case, it's the Java delegate, which we normally recommend. So there might be reasons against that, which are normally found somewhere here in the table. So for example, the connector, the reason for that is normally that you don't have any additional Java required, so you can do anything in the BPMN XML. So that's self-contained. That's the advantage. If you have that use case, do it. Otherwise, better use the Java delegate, just for example. And then the next step is we are not going into details of the Java delegate. We just link the user guide. And there you have already everything. Okay. In this case, we're going a bit further because for Java delegates, we also give recommendations like what should you do in Java delegates. So what we often see is that people, maybe not you, but customers, Camunda users are writing a lot of code in the Java delegates, a lot of business code, and we normally do not recommend that. So very good Java delegates normally look like do some data input mapping, call the real business service, but that should be defined in a different class, in some method, in some bean, in some EJB, and whatever it is, depends very much on the architecture, and then do a data output mapping. Okay, so this is a good pattern to follow, and in this case, we then also give code examples in order to visualize that much more and explain these kind of things. Okay. What we have very often are these so-called bonus chapters. Bonus chapters is what I mentioned earlier. When we leave the scope of the core product, it's normally a bonus chapter, so that's kind of a bonus for you, but it also gives you a hint that this is far more away from the core product. And here we find our calling SOAP web services. So that's basically the recommendation. Use JAX-VS, do a client generation. We linked the right resources to make it easy. There's also a non-supported example somewhere in our repositories, which we linked here, which is quite old, but actually it hasn't changed much technology there. So this should give you the right pointers in order to get started. Then we, for example, we also recommend not to use a SOAP connector unless you want to have that self-contained BPMN XML, because it's normally much easier to generate client code, to have the compiler check. You can hook that into the Maven build and whatever. So these are normally, these are recommendations we give. Again, that might not fit to your situation. We try to make that 80-20 case here. So for a lot of customers, that fits very well. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong, right? So, okay. So we're doing the same for JMS, for example. So we also use that very often as an answer. If the people are asking, do you have a JMS connector? We're answering like, we don't have a JMS connector, but you can hook in Java code very easy and look at the look at that example. This is how you can send a JMS message, and it's totally easy to do, and you don't have to mess around with proprietary Camunda stuff. It's normal Java stuff. You can find that code very easy by Googling. And you find more information about that in the internet as well. Okay, so I think that's okay for that best practice for now. So here we, for example, also have that calling SAP system thing. Okay, so that was one example best practice and basically how we try to lay out the best practices here. The next interesting question is basically the access to the best practices. So, sorry, how can you find your way through the best practices? So one thing could be by keywords. You can basically also go through the list of best practices. So that's the whole list we have at the moment. So approximately 30 best practices. We're adding more and more over time. So we're continuously working on that, but that's it. So we group them by stakeholders. So depending on who you are, you might be interested in different best practices. We are currently implementing a search as well. So we might add a search very soon, but at the moment there's no search available. So that's not yet there. Another very interesting thing to get started with the best practices, what we call the customer success path. So what we did is we didn't want to, we didn't want to invent our Camunda the Camunda development process or whatever you want to call it. So we wrote down what we saw at a lot of customers, what went very well when they introduced Camunda BPM. And that's what we written down in the customer success path. And if we look at that, it normally starts by evaluating if BPM makes sense for a company and what are the basically the return on invest you want to have, what are advantages, why you basically want to do a BPM initiative. That normally happens before Camunda is involved somehow. Sometimes we help there as well, but most of the time it's before Camunda is involved. Then you start some evaluation, and the best practice is to select Camunda BPM, so that makes very good sense. And then basically you follow very often that process here, that you identify a first process you want to implement. I called that lighthouse process here because it's kind of a process where a lot of people in the company will look at later on, because the first project is normally something everybody looks at later on. So it's important to choose the right process here. So that's something we, by the way, we added here with that flyouts or callouts. We add some information here. So some of the things I tell you now are basically written down with the callouts. We're using BPMN IO, by the way. So the right lighthouse process is a very important decision, because you shouldn't do something like a vacation request because it's too easy, it's too boring, and you cannot show real advantages of BPM in your company. So it should be something much closer to your core processes. But it should also be not too big, because then if you have like a 3 years project, the risk of not finishing it is high, and you're just taking too long until you can show off something. So it should be something you can go live within, I would say, 3 to 6 months is a good time frame. And something relevant, something where you can show the advantages. And what we always recommend is not to, so very often people are doing in parallel already something like process landscape, like trying to get a list of processes in the company and these kind of things. I think, and we recommend to not to put too much effort into that initiative. So do as much to identify a good process, but then get started. The first thing normally is a proof of concept. We have an own best practice on that, so I will go into details later on. After the proof of concept, you normally can decide to go with Camunda BPM and to go with that process. So you develop the process, so I call it pilot here, but basically developing the process application. prepare operations. So that means a lot of things about security, getting the right hardware. If you have hardware, getting the right environment up to speed, getting the right people involved, getting monitoring set up, and all these kind of questions which come with going live, and then really go live. So we always recommend to go live with the process as soon as possible, because after that step you will have learned a lot. So these two steps are very interesting, so you shouldn't skip them, do them. And after then, if possible, only after then, implement the next processes, because after that you have learned a lot. Sometimes customers start doing 2 or 3 projects in parallel. That's fine as well. It has some challenges, but fine as well. Just yeah, I should have a look at a couple of things then. What we recommend is after you went live, to do a really good review, to discuss the pilot, and to take some time to improve it, because normally that project, a lot of people will look at it. A lot of people will maybe copy paste from it. So it's worth the effort to improve it afterwards. And you can normally, you can save the effort of doing it too correct in the first step, because that does make too much sense. A lot of people discuss here very, very, very long to do it right in the first place, because they know that people will look at it later on. So they try to be correct. But you have to do it once in order to learn everything, in order to really to judge what is correct. I mean, even if Camunda or a partner is helping in that phase, you still have to gather some experience before you know what is correct in your environment. And so we recommend to save the effort here, to be fast, to go live, and then take some time to improve it. That makes much more sense. And a word of warning, we always recommend not to build your own huge BPM platform. And a lot of customers are tending to do that, especially big companies. So they start to introduce own super classes, on monitoring tools, on connector tools, on IDEs or whatever. And so they put a lot of upfront effort in getting that right before they really know what they need. So the same thing goes here. So do your first like 3 or 4 projects. After that, you will have learned what makes sense to harmonize in a central platform. So that's our view on the best practice. Again, you might see that differently. That might be fine as well, right? So if you take that customer success part, what we did is, let me grab a bit smaller again. We took the main phases of the customer success part and listed for different stakeholders or roles the most relevant best practices from our view. So the idea here is to limit the number of best practices, so we have more than that. But these are the best practices you should make sure you have a look at when starting processes. So for example, at the very beginning, normally some product manager at the customer is doing some rough effort estimation, because they have to get a decision to go for a pilot project or for proof of concept. So there we give, for example, some information on influencing factors on the effort for developing process applications or process solutions. So there's no easy formula to do that, because it depends on so much different things. So we have customers which might develop a small process and go live in 3 days, and we have customers they need 3 weeks in order just to get the hardware ready or whatever. So that there are big differences, but we try to make it transparent how to approach that. And we also give a very small example of the invoice process. You might know that because it's our example in the distribution. And we give you an example of which work items we see there and how we would estimate the effort for that. So that could give you an idea how much effort this process is, which actually is a big range. So yeah. But it should give you an indication. Okay, so that's effort estimation. The next is doing a proper proof of concept. That's a very interesting one, actually. We're sending that around a lot because we're doing a lot of proof of concepts. And there, for me, the most important thing is that one. So let's have a look at that. So there are a lot of possible goals you have in a proof of concept. So you might be, for example, verify that Camunda BPM works in your environment, that it can call your SAP system, your SOAP web service, your whatever it is, SaaS environment tool, or whatever. So you want to verify that this works in your technical environment. That might even result in a JUnit test, which is green, which is perfectly fine. So, and then everybody's happy. So that's one possible goal. Another goal we see very often is that for example, IT or the development already wants to go for Camunda BPM, but has to convince other stakeholders like business departments or decision makers or whoever it is. And that might mean that you want to do a good showcase in order to show advantages, which might be very colorful or whatever, very different to this goal. Or you might want to walk through a BPMN you already have prepared in order to discuss BPMN patterns or whatever it is. All of these goals are perfectly valid, but the important thing is to make sure you know which goal you have in the proof of concept and that this is transparent to everybody in the proof of concept. Because if you start mixing them, it doesn't work. So if you start to verify every technical thing, but expect at the end of the week that you have something really colorful to convince upper management, that's tears basically the proof of concept apart somehow. Okay, yeah, and then there are more informations on that. I mean, you can read the best practice later on if you're interested in the details. I just wanted to point out the scope of the best practice. So we are also going in these areas. Next thing, which is pretty, I would say, basic but very important, is to how to create good readable process models. So there are a couple of things which you should incorporate when modeling, which makes it much easier, really much easier readable. And we see a lot of models out there. And if they follow these guidelines, it's much easier to read them. So, for example, the easiest thing is you should label all BPMN elements, which is, I think, very obvious, but very often not the case. So, for example, we see very often that gateways have no description, so it's hard to guess what the different sequence flow means and these kind of things. We also give recommendations on how to name them. So, that's the object verb thing, and this is the events, they are passive because they have happened, and these kind of things. Let's go back there. And other things like modeling symmetrically, you're not forced to it, but it makes it much easier to read from left to right, unless you're in a cultural environment where right to left is the normal case, then do it the other way around, obviously. And so on, so on. So that's actually very easy to do if you know this. It's very easy to follow. So what we normally do is with the first process models, we see at the customer or they do themselves is use that as a kind of checklist to go through it after you modeled it. And after 2 or 3 times you have them in your head, and then you can just use them automatically. There are some things which are often discussed in there as well. So, for example, we see it as a best practice to avoid lanes in BPMN. We discuss that regularly, so you might have a different opinion on that. That's perfectly fine as well. What we try to do in the best practice is to give our arguments why we think you should avoid lanes. So. Okay. So this is our best practices we have. If we go more on the technical side, on the architectural side, it might be something very interesting, also very hard best practice actually is the how to decide about your stack. So these are the very, very, very basic decisions you have to do at the very beginning, at the point in time where you don't have a lot of experience with Camunda BPM. So that's normally stuff we also tackle in the proof of concepts very often, and that makes a lot of sense to discuss that with us or with your partner consulting you. There you see, for example, should you use the shared engine or the embedded engine? So we give again forces and advantages and arguments for both of them. Or what is a good example? Yeah, what programming framework you should use, like Spring or CDI or OSGI. So we also, for example, here we give a recommendation that supported is only Spring and CDI. So OSGI, for example, is only a community extension, so it's not supported. That's something you should know when you're going for OSGI, and so on and so on, also for the application service. One thing we discussed a lot actually internally, but I think is very important in some scenarios. We defined something we call the greenfield stack. That's actually an own best practice. The greenfield stack is a stack we always recommend if the customer don't care. So that happens in situations, for example, if they're not Java folks. So, for example, if they're using .NET, they actually have no opinion on if they use Tomcat or JBoss or Wildfly or WebSphere. They actually don't care. They don't know the differences. We also have situations where the people know Java but don't have any preference. We also have situations where we have to decide, for example, what we use in the training. And so we decided on one greenfield stack we always recommend in that situation. It doesn't mean that this is somehow the best or superior stack. Not at all. It's just one stack we selected. Okay, because it has to be one stack because it means you don't have to think about it. So currently we have Camunda BPM Enterprise Edition for sure on Wildfly 10 with Java 8, the shared engine using Postgre as a database, or in development using HG. For development environment, develop process applications as web archives, using Maven and using Eclipse as IDE. I mean, that depends. If you're using NetBeans, you keep using NetBeans or IntelliJ or whatever. But if you don't care, use Eclipse and use the Camunda model. So that's a greenfield stack. We also posted our motivation why we propose that stack. So, for example, we recommend, or we added Wildfly to that stack instead of Tomcat to have Java transaction integration out of the box. It's also an advantage to have JAX WS, JAX RS for REST and SOAP web services out of the box. So that makes life easier. In Tomcat, you would have to add a couple of things. We wanted to have all components open source, so it's not Oracle, it's not WebSphere, so it's Postgre and Wildfly. Yeah. And for example, Postgre has a good track record for performance, so it's Postgre and not MySQL, for example. But again, it doesn't mean that this is the best stack, not at all. It's the one stack we propose as a greenfield stack. So let's quickly look back. So we have other best practice on decide about the task list. So do you use the Camunda BPM task list? Do you use your own custom task list? Do you use a third-party task list already existing? Yeah, so there are a couple of more best practices here. We already have the invoking services from the process. The same is the other way around. So how do I start a process instance by a REST service? How do I correlate messages coming in via JMS? How do I, end user task via SOAP? So these are questions, maybe not the user task, that was the wrong example, sorry, are answered in that best practice. We have something about handling data. That's maybe interesting to have a quick look at. So what we always recommend in our trainings and workshops is to have as less data as possible in the process. So that's basically written down here as well. So the best is to store references only. There are use cases, so to store also payloads. So sometimes it makes sense to store payloads. So we try to write that down here. Because we are using strings as variable names, it's sometimes handy to create constants classes or what we call a data accessor class in order to do the casting and these kind of things, because sometimes people argue that we have an untimed interface for variables, we have strings as names, so that's very unhandy to use in development, and this is basically the typical answer. Use a data accessor class and you can encapsulate that in a small Java class. You have your own control, and that's very easy to do. Sorry. Okay. So that's the practice. Oh, sorry. That's didn't want to do that. We have a best practice on testing. So yeah, maybe you don't go into details there. So we basically recommend the testing scope, or maybe the testing scope is interesting to have a quick look at. So what we normally recommend at least to do, or if you do something, then do what we call scope 1. So the scope 1 means the BPMN process model, including all expressions, which might be on the sequence flow, and your delegation code, so task listeners, execution listeners, Java delegates. So because they do the data mapping, so you can really test the data flow and that everything fits together well, but do not call the real services, hook in mocks. And then this could be a JUnit test in memory. You don't need any container, you don't need any job executor. They're running very fast. You can hook them in the continuous integration. So that makes a lot of sense to write these kind of test cases. Yeah, and then we describe basically how we normally do it. So basically you go or drive the process through the different steps, assert that you are in the right state. We normally test the happy path and then create own methods to test exceptions from the happy path, where you can start in a certain moment in the process and go on from there. And these are things we describe here. Okay. We have something on securing. So, for example, the REST API and the standard distribution doesn't have any authorization at all. So that should be changed. It's easy to change, but you have to think about it. So that's, for example, mentioned here above other things. Among other things. Yeah, we have something about sizing. So what hardware do you need? So normally we have customers doing really huge things, but most of the environments are fairly easy, actually. So with this, yeah, more or less small server, you can do a lot in Camunda already. So that's about sizing. And a very interesting one, maybe the last one to have a quick look at, is the operating. So there we add different things, for example, how to recognize and manage incidents, because that's asked very often. And there, for example, we recommend what we call a passive solution. So you can query some performance indicators we mentioned here. So for example, open jobs, open incidents, running process instance count. This can be done very easy via REST API. And then you can hook that into something you already have, like Nagios on Singer is very popular. And then just monitor the numbers. And if they get above a threshold, it could be for open incident 0, you can do an alarming in the systems you already have. So this is something, for example, we describe here. But we also, in a sense of DevOps, for example, we make recommendations how to model for easier operations. So there's something we call save points. You might have already heard about the asynchronous before and after flags. They are very important. And we even have scenarios in the service orchestration area where customers basically make all the services asynchronous before, because that results in a behavior where the process engine stops at that service task when something went wrong and do a retrying here, creates an incident here, and these kind of things. So that makes operating much easier and much more intuitive. So that can be a good thing to do. So that's kind of a best practice. If you wanna apply that in your scenario, it should be something you discuss within your project. What I can show here as well, we don't have a lot of anti-patterns yet in the best practices, but we will add more in the future. We wanted to make sure to lay out them correctly first, because it was important for us that when scrolling through, you immediately see that's an anti-pattern. So this is not what you should do, because we see that so often that people want to really model that in their BPMN process to call a service. If there's an error, we check if we have retries. If yes, we wait for some time, we do it again. And if no, we put that on the task list of an operator, which basically can decide what to do, to retry again, to abort, or to skip that task and to move on with the next. And this is some functionality you can do within the platform via API, via Cockpit. So don't model that in the BPMN process. You will go crazy if you do service task. Okay, so that's something we also try to tackle in the best practice. Okay, so that was already quite a lot I showed you. Maybe one last hint. If you look at the best practices at the moment, we tackle basically BPMN most of the time. That's because that's the, I don't want to say old, actually, the most mature standard we implement, and that's what basically all customers are doing. And CMMN and DMN is much newer to the platform, but we also started adding best practices about that. So for example, if I look at the version on my local host, you see something which is not yet released, for example, about choosing the right DMN hit policy, or something about CMMN. So that's in the scope of the best practices as well. Okay, I hope that was not too boring and somehow gave you an overview of what we tackle in the best practices. If you have any questions, let us know in the question window. We answer that in 5 minutes or so. If you have feedback, maybe not now or whenever you read the best practice, if you have feedback, send us an email. Okay, normally we will respond quickly, but most of the things we receive, we add to the backlog and prioritize, because we already have a lot of things in the backlog. That might mean that will not be incorporated immediately, but we are really happy to take any feedback we get. So as soon as you see something, as you wonder about something, maybe just send an email before thinking too much about it. Okay, so to sum it up, the best practices are available. So that's the URL. You can access them with your enterprise subscription credentials. If you don't have them, get them. You can print them as PDF. Maybe that's important information. So we lay out it in a way that the PDF is readable, that the links are contained. So you can even share that easier in the company with people which might not have the credentials. And it's totally okay to share that within your company. So you can send it around, you can link it in your wiki, so that's exactly what you can do with them. You're not allowed to distribute them externally, so you don't put them on the blog or whatever, right? So I think that's for sure. So use them. We're happy if they help you. That's why we have built them. We continuously improve them. So that's something I'm really living. For example, with every release, we are rechecking them if something changed and adjusting them. So they're always up to date with the latest release. Give us feedback, and totally okay to disagree with stuff we have in there. Okay. So that's it from my perspective now. So we still have some time for questions. I'm not sure if we have questions. Maybe Jakob knows.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Bernd. So yes, we do have questions indeed. So let me go through them and sum them up. The first one is very hands-on. I mean, you mentioned it a number of times, but I will quickly answer it once again. So someone asked, the credentials to log into the best practices. So again, all of you attending this webinar are either employees of one of our customers or one of our partners. So as customers or partners, there's always dedicated contact people who have received the credentials that you can use for downloading, for example, the Camunda BPMN Enterprise Edition, but also, for example, accessing the CamundaCon best practices. So this means that please turn to your liaison officer, so to say, so the person that is in charge of Camunda BPM within the organization, and that person can share the credentials with you. All right. So now there are actually some technical questions, like really hands-on questions. So one is here. Let me quickly read it, and then you can answer it. What is the best way to get historical data for data mining? Question mark. Using historical tables? Question mark. So what's your answer to
that? I would answer that with the best practice, basically. So I haven't shown that, but there's one about reporting. I would put that in the area of reporting. Maybe data mining is not exactly reporting, but handled in that best practice. And there are basically two possible ways. So the first is to pull data out of it. So you can either use Query API, that means Java or REST API, or you can use SQL, so database tables, or you can push events. So you can also hook in some plugin in Camunda in order to push everything that happens to something where you process it. So, for example, Elasticsearch or whatever. And these are the three basic possibilities. If you want to pull, Query API is very robust, more stable, because the API we give guarantees on. SQL is normally much more performant. You can do much more things, but less robust. So that's basically what you have to decide.
All right. Thank you. Then there's another question which is very specific. So I will read it and yeah, like more or less literally. So when implementing service tasks which perform non-transactional stuff, we often face the problem of retry because of optimistic locking exception. We think to wrap them, okay, this is like really like reading it loud now. We think to wrap them to a piece of code which checks if such task was already done or not. Is there some unique ID provided by Camunda per activity, which is the same on retry but different per process instance and per loop? For example, if multi-instance is used.
I hope you can look somewhere in the middle.
Okay, so it seems to be very specific. Yeah, true.
It is, and I think it would be easier for me if I have it in the chat window, if you can post it there, because I lost one or two checks in there.
Basically, I can probably do that. So okay, I will directly send that to you. This is the first part. And yeah, just a second. I mean, it's an interesting way, really, of looking at these questions, but it's working.
We still have time, I mean.
Yeah, it's okay, it's okay. So, okay, that's the second part.
Okay.
So it's apparently about retries and consistency challenges or transaction challenges.
Non-transactional stuff, definitely power of retry. So that's, I guess, the optimistic lock exception is from the code you call then, I guess. Check the search was already done or not. I think it actually would need to dive a bit deeper into that, because I would have a couple of counter questions in order to understand it completely. So it might get a bit hard to answer right now.
Okay, is there any parts in the best practices that might be helpful for that area?
The area, yes, a bit. So there are two things. So especially here, it's linked dealing with problems and exceptions. So that's an own best practice. And there we basically handle the transactional thing. So that we use asset transactions and how we are using them, how to roll back, how that works. So that's handled a bit, but I think it stops exactly one step before what is asked here. But that's what I mean. I still have to understand it completely. So that could give you a direction, but it seems to be a bit more specific here.
All right. Well, I mean, that's actually a good example for, what makes sense to leave the matter of best practices and reading them and actually get in touch with us and discuss that question. So, I mean, that's what you have the support access for. I mean, it's about best practice, but typically you have also so-called remote consulting with your subscription, or if not, please come back to your account manager and clarify that. But I mean, of course, there's a certain natural limit to specific questions that demand a deeper understanding and dive into what you're currently trying to achieve. Of course, that makes sense. Yeah. There's another question which is more. I don't need to read that aloud, I believe, because it's pretty general. So there's a question which is apparently about the matter of how to involve non-developers when it comes to defining decision tables in DMN, for example. So the question is, it sounds a bit like a request rather than a question, but still, is there anything in the best practices about that kind of matter? So we want to express certain things in decision tables. We want to work with our business analysts to do that, and we would love to have some guidance here. Maybe there's something about BPMN already, but DMN is also mentioned here. So, any thoughts on this?
It's basically something we tackle in the backlog. So we don't have anything released yet about DMN. So if you look through it, you will not see any DMN. But we start to develop best practices there and basically to write them down, because we're doing more and more DMN projects and try to gather everything we get and discuss them and extract the best practices. That's what we're currently doing in consulting. And the first thing which will be visible out there is choosing the right DMN hit policy. So there are normally different strategies how to use the right hit policy to express a certain problem, and that's the first thing we will release. And I think there will be more things to follow. So yeah, it's coming up, but it's not yet there. But it's cool to have the request, so that seems to we have sorted our backlog right.
Yeah, exactly. That brings me to my last thing before we actually wrap it up for today. So if there's any certain topics, any areas of knowledge that you would like to see covered in the best practices, just send them to us. Maybe just right now in the questions window, but also via email. So there's enough channels, I believe, to provide us your feedback and your requests. So we will create the best practices that you request at the end of the day. So therefore, it would be very helpful to understand what's quickly lacking in the documentation or in the other material that you can find online, and we will basically prioritize based on that. So there's some stuff trickling in already, so that's great. Thanks for that. And what I forgot to mention is that this webinar is being recorded, so this means that you will be able to watch it afterwards, and you will get the specific link for that. And yeah, that's about it for today. So thank you, Bernd, and thanks to all of you attending.
Thanks, guys, for listening. Yeah.
And happy processing, of course. Have a good night. Take care. Bye.
Bye, guys.